Last week, one of the big ideas, and I'm not sure that I put it into these terms, but I should have, we had three different contours in Old Testament prophecy. First of all, remember that God came to Abraham and talked about blessing him, and this blessing idea where God's promise, the promise of God's presence, to be with his people, and then the factor that we looked at all throughout the Old Testament is in the land. There was that land theme that you see heavily in the Old Testament. But then with that came a warning of judgment, warnings of judgment, and they would culminate ultimately in removal from the land if God's people were not obedient. And so due to disobedience, they might be removed from the land. And remember, that actually happened. It happened not just once, it actually happened twice. First, the northern 10 tribes of Israel were removed from the land. They were removed by the Assyrian invasion. And then the southern kingdom of Judah was actually removed from the land too, and the temple was destroyed. And Ezekiel has this vision of God leaving the building, leaving the temple. But then there's a promise of restoration. And so these three contours of blessing and judgment and then restoration conditioned upon if they repented. And in Daniel chapter 9, apparently he's been reading Jeremiah. You know, sometimes the Old Testament prophets read other Old Testament prophets that had been already written. And he's reading Jeremiah, and he sees that part about God promising to bring them back into the land if they repent. And he thinks, oh my, have we repented? And in chapter 9 of Daniel, before you get to the prophetic part, you have Daniel praying a prayer of repentance on behalf of the nation. And asking, have we really repented? But they do come back into the land, and they rebuild the temple, and they wait for the presence of God to come back. And we don't read about it happening. Instead, the last book of the Old Testament ends with a promise that one day God's going to come back to his temple. And then, as a fifth grader would say, the end, and it's like, what happened? And we wait 500 years. And the other thing we noticed last week was that sometimes you'll have a prophecy that is up close and personal and in your face and about to be fulfilled, but there will be with that something that from your vantage point it looks like right there too, but actually is far removed. And we're going to open up this morning by looking at another such prophecy, but this time we're going to go to Jesus. And so that sort of brings us up to from last week to the present. Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, we have Jesus, and he comes to Nazareth. And if you go to Nazareth today, they've actually built what they believe is a synagogue looking very much like it would have in that day. And it's about okay. It's okay. Do what you have to do. It's about a third of the size of this room. Or maybe even smaller. It's this little tiny place, and you could probably fit everybody in Nazareth in that little tiny room back then, not today. Nazareth has grown a lot. So he came to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah, when you read book in the Old Testament, the same word can be used for scroll, Old or New Testament. So I imagine this was probably more on the level of a scroll that was handed to him. And he opened the book or the scroll and found the place where it was written. And here Luke quotes the passage in Isaiah from which he's writing, or from which Jesus is reading. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed upon him. And he began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So he reads, he sits down, he's saying, did you hear what I read? You're seeing it. However, there's something interesting that's taken place, and Luke doesn't mention it. But if we go back and we look at Isaiah chapter 61, that passage from which he read. It's the same words. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted, and he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. And you can see where Jesus had been doing those things, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. And notice that at least in Luke's telling of the story, that we stop mid-sentence. Now, to be fair, I have to point out that sometimes when you have a sermon being given, you're having only a synopsis that's given. And so maybe Jesus said other things. It's possible, I suppose, that Jesus even read other things. But in Luke's telling of the story, he stops midway through a sentence. And notice verse 2, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. And Jesus doesn't, at least Luke doesn't have Jesus reading that portion. And mid-sentence, Jesus stops, at least in Luke's telling of it, and puts the scroll away and says, that has been fulfilled. And I think Luke is doing it, and maybe Jesus read it that way, because a portion of this hadn't taken place yet. That even though these things that we've read about leading up to that were taking place in that first coming of Jesus, that there was something else. The day of vengeance of God, of our God, was going to take place far in the future. And so again, looking at our idea of a near event, and now for the first time it's hinted at, and we're going to look at the first time that Jesus actually teaches it, he speaks of both near events, but also that his coming would be a first coming divided by a long period of time again, or at least a period. We're not told how long it would be. That there would be both a first coming, but also a day of judgment, also a second coming. And so this was not something that the Old Testament prophets had ever seen. Using, again, our mountaintop illustration, when you see the mountains from afar, they all look just clustered together. It's not until you get close to them, and maybe even over the first peak, that you see, oh goodness, there's this big open valley between this peak and the next one. Well, the place where Jesus begins to clearly teach it, and I almost hesitate to use that word clearly, is when he comes to the parables. Matthew tells a story in Matthew chapter 13. We're going to look at a number of them, although not all. Matthew 13, verse 24, Jesus presents, and he's already presented the parable of the four types of soil. I'm going to pass over that one in the interest of time. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good field in his field. And now he begins to tell the story. A man sowed good seed in his field, but while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares or weeds among the wheat and went away. So guy's got a field, everybody's asleep that night, and somebody that doesn't like the man comes in and fills the field with weeds, with tares, and goes away. But when the wheat sprouted, and that didn't happen overnight, this is probably several weeks or months later, when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares also became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, an enemy has done this. The slave said to him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, no, for while you are gathering up the tares, if you just went out to pull up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, when that season finally is, we're ready to harvest, and in that time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. So the separation isn't going to take place. In fact, we see three different ideas in this story. And Jesus hasn't explained the story yet, but he will. First of all, they're both to grow together. There's to be this time where they are growing together. And secondly, that they are to be separated at a later season, at the harvest. And then thirdly, the tares will be taken out and burned, but the wheat's going to be gathered, and it will be preserved, and it will be okay. That's the idea behind the story. And then rather than explaining it, Jesus is going to come back to that and again, he goes on to tell several other parables. So let's look at those. Chapter 13, verse 31, he presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven. And notice each one of these is a parable of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven. You see, the Jewish people at that point, based upon their reading of those Old Testament passages talking about the kingdom was going to be this time when God came back and everything was great, and God would judge the bad people and he'd bless the good people. And to put it in those terms, he would give them the land, judgment would take place, they would be restored, and everything's happily ever after. And Jesus is telling them, yes, that's true, but there's a few other mountains and valleys that I have to let you know about. So he presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And in case you didn't know it, this is smaller than all other seeds, but when it is full grown, it's larger than the garden plants and becomes not just a bush, but a tree. A small one, but yes. And it's larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And so the idea here, the kingdom of heaven is like that which starts off very small. At this point, Jesus and 12 disciples. In fact, before it was over, that would even get a bit smaller. Starts off very small, but then becomes very, very, relatively, compared to a seed, very big. Another parable that he presents. Chapter 13, verse 31, he presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of... we already saw that, I'm sorry. But notice that last line, the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And I remember the first time I read that, and somebody asked, well, what about the birds of the air? And I thought, well, it's just sort of like embellishing the story a little bit. You know, in other words, it's that big that a bird that could come and eat a seed now sits in its branches. And I didn't think much about it until I noticed, wait a minute, he's quoting from the Old Testament. When you hear that line, you hear the parable, and it's, well, that's an interesting parable. The kingdom of heaven starts off small and it ends up big. But when he adds that part about how the birds of the air come and nest in its branches, that is supposed to catch your attention, because you're supposed to say, oh, I've heard those words before. You know how it is when somebody's talking, all of a sudden they will maybe talk about the land of the free and the home of the brave, or some sort of phrase that you've heard, but you've heard it in song. And so likewise, when you hear that, you're supposed to say, wait a minute, I've heard that before, because Ezekiel chapter 17 uses that phrase in a prophecy, speaking of, actually by way of something of a riddle. The prophet himself calls it, let me show you the riddle of the house of Israel. And here was the riddle: on the high mountain of Israel, I will plant it, that it may bring forth boughs and bear fruit and become a stately cedar. And the birds of every kind will nest under it, and they will nest in the shade of its branches. And so when you hear that line, Jesus repeating that line, it calls to mind a previous prophecy that had taken place. A prophecy speaking about Israel, and Israel is likened to a vine that's uprooted, but that will be taken and replanted in the land. And the question is, will it grow or not? And the answer is yes, it's going to grow. And Jesus is saying, that's the kingdom. It starts off very small. And his hearers might have been thinking, wait a minute, small, Israel's pretty good size at this point. And Jesus is saying, no, it's a lot smaller than you realize. It's going to start off very small, but it will grow. And he promises to plant this tender twig that will grow up into something that will fill the world. And so he comes to another parable. Chapter 13, verse 33, he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until all of it was leavened. Oops, let me not leave that first too quickly. Again, leaven is this little portion of yeast. Actually, my son-in-law has been doing this bread baking thing and then getting their own wheat, milling his wheat. I have no idea what that is. God bless him. And, I come as close to that when I go to the grocery store and buy the bread. I'm not, into this. But you take this little bit of yeast, of leaven, and place it into the bread, and it's what causes the bread to rise. Otherwise, it's my understanding that you bake the bread and it just becomes this big flat cracker. And if you want that fluffiness to the bread, you put in the leaven. And so the kingdom of heaven is described in terms of leaven. That's sort of interesting because leaven in the Bible always represents influence, but usually in other places it refers to a negative influence. I don't think so that's the case here. Here in this case, leaven describes the kingdom. Not that it's bad, but that it, a little bit, just like the previous parable, a little bit goes a long way. A little bit will, in fact, will have an impact upon all the rest and will cause the entire loaf to be changed. Well, he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, "Can you explain to us the parable of the tares of the field?" They didn't want to ask this in public. I notice some people are don't really want to ask because then it'll be obvious that they don't know. And the disciples, as he was telling the parable, they went, "Good point. Good. What did he mean by that?" And so once they get him in private, they come and they ask him, and now he gives the explanation. So this is going back to that first parable, and he's given these others, which are sort of obvious, but that one maybe not so much. And now he explains that first parable, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, and he spells it out for them. Like I said, this is the first time he's clearly going to teach there's not just going to be one coming, but 2. And here it is. He said, the one who sows the good seed, that's the Son of Man, that's me, and the field is the world, excuse me. And as for the good seed, they're the sons of the kingdom. He's planting people. And the tares are the sons of the evil one. So there's 2 kinds of people that are planted. There are his people, and there are not his people that are planted, but they are planted together. Verse 39, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. He's planting people as well. And the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. And so just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. That there will throughout the age be 2 kinds of people planted. And there will be God's people and not God's people. And they will grow up together, and at the end of the age, and that's a key phrase there, at the end of the age, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That you have in the world today God's people and not God's people, and they grow together, and frankly, on quick glance, sometimes it's difficult to tell them apart. And they're growing together. And you have the church and the not the church. Sometimes what even looks like the church, I think. But they're growing together. And it's not until the end of the age that the division will be made, that the judgment takes place. And that final judgment takes place. And notice it's not happy at the end for those that are cast out of the kingdom. Weeping gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous, and this is the happy part, verse 43, then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And then Jesus has this phrase which he uses on a number of occasions. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Sort of a catchword. In other words, this is not all that easy to understand. There's something about this that you have to look beyond the look. And I think maybe that you have to look and ask the question, where am I in that parable? Am I a son of the kingdom? Have I believed in him? Am I following the son of the kingdom? Or am I just going along with the flow? And so the image here, the Son of Man is going to, notice, we're told he's going to send forth his angels. He'll gather them up, those up that are taken away. He'll throw them into the furnace of fire, but the righteous will shine forth as the kingdom. And it's at the harvest that the division takes place. That's the imagery that's used. But we're not done with the parables. A few more. And the others are fairly brief. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. In a very short parable. In other words, the kingdom is very valuable, very precious. And in the parable, the person does whatever he can do to obtain the kingdom. He doesn't let anything stand in his way. He finds it. He goes and gets rid of everything else so that he can obtain the kingdom. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great price, again, something of great value, he went out and sold all that he had and bought it. So he does whatever he can do to obtain the kingdom. Again, the kingdom has great value. Don't let anything stand in your way of not being part of that kingdom. He went and sold all that he had. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet. I'm not a baker and I'm not a fisherman either. But I've been given to understand. In fact, I've seen people doing two kinds of fishing, where one is that they take a net and they throw it out and they pull it in, and this isn't that. That's sort of the easy guy's way. I guess that would be for the non-professional like me. But for a professional fisherman, they would actually take either people or even a boat and lay this net over a big wide area. And then a number of people all pulling at the net to bring it into the shore. And then whatever was surrounded by that, they'd bring it into the shore, and they'd notice the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up onto the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into the containers, but the bad, I'm not sure what a bad fish looks like, but anything else that they didn't want, they threw it away. So again, this idea where they are all gathered together, but there is a separation, mirroring that same idea that we had seen earlier. Parables of the kingdom. And so it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and take out of the wicked from among the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire. In the place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Again, at the end of the age that this takes place. Now I want to move forward to Matthew chapter 24. Jumping out of the parables, and now we move to the end of the ministry of Jesus. It's his last week on earth. And Jesus comes out from the temple where he has been for several chapters presenting himself and his claims. And the Jewish leaders and authorities have rejected him. And he comes out and was going away with his disciples. And they came to point out the temple buildings to him because they were grand and glorious. And he said to them, "Do you not see these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And that was just something amazing to see. What you're looking at here is not the temple, it's the model of the temple, because the temple today isn't there. What Jesus said was true, so true that there are some people that want to argue about where the temple was located. Not one stone has been left upon another. And so Jesus takes them across the valley to the Mount of Olives on the other side, and he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? When is it all going to happen?" And you can hear the question behind the question. Are we there yet? When's it going to be? And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many are going to come in my name, saying, 'I'm the Christ, I'm the Messiah,' and will mislead many. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened, for those things must take place. But that's not the end." If you hear about all these things, Jesus says that's not it. False start. False start. He goes on, "For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes," but that's not it either. At most, he calls that the beginning of birth pangs, which is likening the world to a mother that's pregnant. Is that the baby? No, but one's on its way. "And then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and mislead many, because lawlessness is increased, and most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved or delivered. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world." It was, The book of Acts says repeatedly about how the gospel went out to the whole world. And it still is. We're still in that process. Will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. And then Jesus says something quite puzzling. Puzzling, I'm sure, to those who heard. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," and they've just come out of the temple precincts, and as they're standing on the Mount of Olives, what you get to see is this panoramic view of the temple, and that's where the holy place was located. "When you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," and then Matthew the writer adds this little footnote, "Let the reader," and Jesus didn't say that because there was nobody reading at that point, but Matthew the writer says, "Let the reader understand." In other words, news alert, this is hard to understand. This is not an easy one. And Jesus goes on to say, "Let those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains," and he goes on speaking from there. But when he speaks of that which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, the reader is supposed to say, "Wait a minute, I remember that passage. That's an Old Testament passage from way back in Daniel chapter 11. And it gave a prophecy which, in the eschatological view of that day, had already been fulfilled." Where Daniel had talked about this pagan king that would arise against the Israelites, and forces from him would arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And if you'd asked any Jewish person living in that day, they would just on a test or a quiz, when did that take place? They would have said, "Oh, that was 166 BC. A couple of hundred years ago, where this pagan king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, he was a Greek king. He came in, sort of put down the Jewish people, walked into the temple, had a big statue of Zeus put in the temple. Actually, sort of looked like Antiochus himself, because they didn't know what Zeus looked like. And they said, well, he'll be our role model. And told everybody, you now have to worship this. And that had happened. And now Jesus is citing that prophecy which had been literally fulfilled, and applying it not to the past but to the future. It had happened, and Jesus said, "And again." when you see that. And by the way, within 40 years of Jesus saying these words, you're going to have another Gentile conqueror, this time from Rome, that will come in. He'll invade the temple. He'll actually burn the temple to the ground, and they will build up an altar and worship pagan gods. So not only did it happened again just the way Jesus said it would. And indeed, and I'm not saying this is the fulfillment of it, but I find it striking that if you go to Israel today, and some of you have been there, and you go to that same spot where the Holy of Holies used to stand, there stands on that spot, and I don't mean to be mean when I say that, there stands upon that spot something that I believe to be an abomination that renders it desolate to the worship of God. This big Muslim mosque to this day. Well, Jesus goes on to describe events, and like I said, Titus, the Roman general, came in the year 70 A.D. and destroyed the temple and fulfilled that in a very vivid way. But Jesus goes on in chapter 24 and verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And this sounds very much like what he'd been talking about earlier in those parables. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together. And notice again, the coming of the Lord. And they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power, with great glory. Verse 31, he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. They will gather together his chosen, his elect, his people, from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. That, yes, there had been blessing, and there had been warning, and there had been scattering, but now a regathering, and a regathering at the end of the age of God's people to be with him. And so at the end of the age, immediately after this period of tribulation, Jesus said you're going to have tribulation this age, that you would have the Son of Man coming, that he would come and gather his people. And what Jesus is letting him know, this isn't happening. There would be a first coming, but then a second coming, and it's there that you would see that gathering. And they'll gather together his elect to be with him. So, chapter 24, verse 37, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. In what way? Verse 38, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. In other words, life went on. They were doing all the things that you did in life. Not necessarily, these aren't necessarily bad things, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. I guess it can be bad depending on who you marry and what you eat and so on, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Life went on until that took place, and then it was all over. Until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, and so will the coming of the Son of Man be. That there would be life, and then there wouldn't be life. And verse 40, then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken, and one will be left. And two women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken, and one will be left. And that life will go on until he comes, and all of a sudden there is a dividing and a separation, and God gathers his people, and others are taken to judgment. And the point that he makes, verse 42, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming, but be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, and that thief illustration is going to be used again and again throughout the New Testament. That the coming of the Lord, that the day of the Lord, that his coming will be like a thief. And the thief doesn't call you up and say, I'm coming today. In other words, it's going to be unexpected. That it's going to catch you by surprise. And if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief had been coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, because it will be unexpected, because it won't be pre-announced, for this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. When's he coming? At a time when you're not expecting. So be always expecting, be always ready, be always faithful. And that's the point. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give him their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. Now I want to pause here, even though I've got a little bit more. I want to pause here and open it up for questions. I told you I'd do that. Or have we answered them all? That's a great question. Okay. The question was, is this referring to Israel or is this referring to everyone? And my answer is yes. Yes, it is Israel. But, when we came to Christ, we came to a Jewish Messiah. Right? And we were grafted into something that was called Israel. And we became part of something that was a lot older than us. And so my answer is yes. Is that, remember how the new covenant is described way back in Jeremiah chapter 31? With the new covenant, God says, I'm going to make a covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And you say, wait a minute, what are we doing partaking of the Lord's Supper? The cup and bread of the new covenant, if that was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And the answer is that we've entered into that. We have become spiritual children of Abraham by believing the way Abraham believed. So my answer is yes. Good question, though. Good question. Another question. Seeing and hearing none. We're going to move to the... Did I miss something? Okay, we're going to move to the next chapter. I'm jumping over a number of parables to where in chapter 25, and it's part of the same sermon. It's part of the same passage. Was that a question? I'm sorry. No, okay. Sorry. Part of the same sermon, where in chapter 25, verse 31, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and he sort of left that, he was talking about that, he had described the gathering that takes place, and then he paused to give some parables along the way that we jumped over. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, and he's just described that in the previous chapter, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. And now there is a separation between the nations and the people, and the king will say to those on his right, come you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And so there's a separation that takes place in chapter 25, a judgment between what are called here the sheep and the goats. Again, that's an Old Testament allusion. We won't turn there, but Ezekiel chapter 34 actually uses that analogy. So it was a familiar idea to those Jewish hearers. And he separates between them, and I don't have the passage up here, but I'm going to read it. I'm going to continue reading in chapter 25 and verse 35, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And the righteous are going to say, are you sure you have the right person? Not complaining, but I don't remember any of that. I don't remember seeing you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, because after all, I came to Jesus and the death, burial, and resurrection had already taken place. I never even saw you. And the king says, you did it to one of these. That was me. That was me. And then conversely, the same thing happens, almost the same conversation, where he says in verse 41, he will say to those on his left, depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you did not invite me in. Naked and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison and you did not visit me. And they are described as saying, Lord, that wasn't us. We didn't see you in any of those conditions. We didn't see that situation taking place. I mean, we would have baked you some cookies. And he says to them, you saw me all around. No, I didn't have them, sorry. And these will go into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now that's sobering. It's sobering because, notice, it is a judgment that is based, can I say it? A judgment that on the surface of it is based on works. And we're going to see in the next 2 weeks, there will be a number of times that judgment is described. One of those is going to be in Corinthians, and others will be in the book of Revelation, and every single time it's going to consistently describe that your works are being judged. And you think, oh my, I thought that we were saved by grace through faith. And I'm not going back on that. You are. But if you're saved by grace through faith, one of the things we see in the scriptures is that faith produces something in your life. And you say, I haven't seen it produce anything in my life. Well, and I'm not saying go start working, but I am saying go back to the cross. Go back to the one who saves, and make sure that you haven't just gone through the motions. And trust in him as your Lord, as your Savior. And ask him to do a good work in you, and he will. But there's a judgment here that's described by Jesus, and I don't want to water that down because it's sober and it's serious and it's supposed to be. Where works will be judged. Now, the good news, I've been working this week, and I'm going to close on this note. I've been working this week, and I had written this thing years ago, but it sat basically unfinished, a commentary on the book of Revelation. And I shuddered to do that because, it's a tough book. But I'm almost done. I think teaching this class has sort of pushed me a little bit further, and I needed that. And there's a passage there in Revelation where it talks about the books being opened, but then the book of life. And it's where there's two categories, the books, and that sounds very much like that judgment, but then there's also the book of life. And yes, there's a judgment of what we do. Both, and let me just say this in no uncertain terms because we're going to see it next week, both for Christians and for non-Christians. There's a judgment of what we do. But then there's the book of life. And there's that relationship with Christ and the salvation that he gives. And the book of life comes from those who have partaken of the tree of life. And the tree of life is provided because our Savior went to a tree of death and obtained it for us. And so the message is that you trust in him, the one who went to our tree of death that he might give us of the tree of life.